Hello everyone, today we talk about the governmental control on the Italian communes between the 13th and the 14th century. We took a further step in the history of these polities by concentrating on their process of statalization and power concentration starting from the mid-13th century. We have already provided with ample background to the major, say, contextual situations, both internationally and domestically. And I'm speaking, say, in Europe, in Italy, and within the same communes, why the mid-13th century is a watershed, essentially the death of Frederick II, not really the death of the Ghibelline fort, right, to impose the imperial control on the peninsula, but definitely the further autonomization of the Lombard and Tuscan communes on the basis that had already been sanctioned since the Peace of Constance at the end of the 12th century after the defeat of Frederick Barbarossa. The outcome of this is not actually less war, but the concentration of the same military resources, actually the increase of the same, in the creation of some more compact territorial dominions that began to essentially knock out different cities, at least in terms of political independence, in this phase that especially concentrates in the beginning of the 14th century, essentially from the 10s to the 20s, then 30s and the 40s you have probably some regional states already outlined, started from single cities. And this process is enormous because we're talking about an enormous system politically, militarily, socially, enormous amount of wealth, great level of bellicosity, let's say. And so it's just like an era on their own when you think at certain times in history that haven't been conceptualized enough, right, in terms of being real ages in their own respect. This is really what you want to make your medieval studies about, because it's like a never-ending universe, and of course this is valid for any other sort of regional situation if you really go in depth with that. But here we're talking about robust systems, the mechanisms of which must be properly explained in order to, say, highlight the functioning, like how they made it and what did this bring to. And there is, as we'll see today, an inherent tension between a sort of guild system that had never quite been, say, just what had happened in Italian communes, that, as you know, had been ruled essentially by the so-called consular regime, essentially the military one, from the until the essentially beginning of the 13th century. Then there is a popular phase that witnesses the rise of, let's say, some other groups that had remained out, right, after especially the lock of the consular class at a point, and that would succeed, in fact, eroding the ladder and rising in the second half of the 13th century to a actually much larger position of prestige overall, and that are fundamentally the ones that stratify at the same time with the upper echelon successfully establishing a state, right, an institutional body that basically goes beyond, right, supersedes the other traditional consular sort of guild, associational-based communal government, at least the one that had traditionally existed, and makes of the latter, in fact, a proper central authority in an ever more subtle and controlling direction that indeed strengthens dramatically the situation, as what we were saying before at the beginning is that actually the most powerful cities are also the ones that are more successful at this and stabilize a much wider dominion than it had been normally the case with these communes that up to this point had remained fundamentally independent from one another. There were stronger, weaker ones, but they had always sort of remained within the boundaries of their own district. Even if they had offended one another, the capacity of a city to literally like control another directly and founding a territorial state in that sense was something really new, right? Recently we talked about the beginning of the Italian signories as part reflecting this process. It overlaps with what we're going to discuss today as essentially the request for the necessity of a unity of command was overlapping that level of centralization, which doesn't mean actually that the signori would be essentially just like monarchs, as we've seen. It was always a communal body that ruled and accepted or not these figures that later on by the mid 14th century tend to become more dynastic and whatever. But that effect began from quite an early time, right? We talked about it Zellino last time. Today we do not make much like sort of evidential history, but rather like an institutional one, and focusing on one very important aspect of this all, which is really central, if not the most important and chronically overlooked. That is the military expenses, right? Essentially the needs that these polities have to, in fact, to stabilize, to increase their control on the population and the territory, because they need more money to fight wars, right? And those who lose go under, right? Those who succeed instead go up, right? And there is all a political and social transformation in the meanwhile, also due to other sort of broader dynamics in Europe that changed definitely the face of the same Italian communities and culture and beyond, right? So with these videos, we're never definitive, meaning that we're looking just at specific aspects that then every once in a while we wrap the whole thing up in a, for some more introductory purposes. Today, it's sort of halfway, meaning that, of course, you could always go in ultra hardcore depth, but before that, it's important to lay like all the various stones for the foundation. Then you can start building also on other aspects. So this dynamic with which a higher government came to isolate himself within the commune did not entail just a redefinition of the relations between the same and the city institutions, but also a new relation with the different spheres of administration. As we will understand now, warfare costs a lot, and you must essentially ensure the community to be solidal, cohesive. Otherwise, you will essentially, as it had been the case during the consular regime, always have just like the military expenses burdening on a specific class that at some point was also getting sort of more stratified and or was not the only one existing, like, for example, the popolo emerging. Of course, contributing to the military expenses, but something had to change compared to the previous times, which just the militaires had the monopoly of violence, which was not the case anymore with all the paramilitary forces that the popolo had come about. And in part the thing is surpassed by the traditional sensual recruitment system of the Italian communes, except that this happens also in parallel to the redefinition properly of the hierarchy in society, right? There are different phases. We will talk today, say between like even from the beginning of the 13th to essentially the mid 14th century. It's a very comprehensive landscape. So in a majority of these cities, the basic society of the people, of the populace, so this institution that had posed itself in contrast, in competition, in conflict with the militas, had some essentially territorial and corporative foundations, right? And these had already, like, they had historically been based on essentially the quarters, people living in the same neighborhood, going to church in the same parish, and having also lands from their side of the walls, right outside the city gates, and in many ways tending to specialize sometimes part of their crafts and arts on the basis of the same territoriality. Say, I don't know, the 1/4 or sextier, etc., of the city was dedicated to, I don't know, arms and armor production, right? Another one about textile production, things like that. And so they would represent each other in this sort of very cohesive, sort of mafia style sort of compactness regarding each other's respective rights, right? What, of course, the commune instead strives at this point towards, and from the side of the same communities that are also stratified, again, there is an aristocracy, even among the people, there are banal like knights, right, levied by the same. And so these people are eventually already powerful, and they tend to surpass the traditional conflictuality within the city. So the struggle between militas and popolo, the one between, say, Guelphs and Ghibellines, etc. By all the various, say, segmentations, we can think different clans, different guilds, whatever. By establishing a central authority that could provide justice, order, law, right, the respect at least of the constitutions that already existed. And in order to do this, you must invest money, you must essentially push, like guide society towards that agreement. And this passes naturally through warfare in many ways, so within the city streets. The general trend, however, is that exactly because of this instability, the traditional basis of the people that we have already looked at had proven to be unsatisfactory, right? So what takes place is the affirmation of the so-called general societies, right? So some system that encompass the entire city, right, based on different sort of connections. For example, it could be the captain of the people, requiring, say, a part of the popolo to contribute to some military expenses for the local militia, or some other, some corporative level at an association at an oligarchic level, right? And in all this, the smaller, the neighborhoods, the parishes, etc., lost gradually their political role, right? The commune had literally been ruled by this group of different entities that now were too, again, heterogeneous from one another. They had to take, there was a lot of substance. These centers are very rich, they're very dynamic, but in this sense they must be given also a form, and that's where the state comes about. So this starts, interestingly, with the governments intervening in the balance between the various corporative societies. They essentially provided themselves also with some police force, with some, again, paid by these more affluent individuals who were seeking the consensus of some of these groups to eliminate, say, for example, the composition of others, and or privileging, depending on the situation, either the strongest ones or the weaker ones. This goes in parallel, for example, with the popular anti-magnate laws that are essentially issued because of the fear of just one guy trying to make a coup and concentrating power on himself. That's why we were talking about the Signori before, because these guys would always strive to get more power, but the commune as such was also had to be able to counter that, and being equally strong. So at some point you could, I don't know, take out a major group. Sometimes you would instead just like suppress a smaller one, because it favored the balance of this essentially still conciliar mechanism. Like, it was a plurality of leaders here who were negotiating this arrangement to run the commune, right, smoothly, because they were the same people owning, say, the guilds, the land, having also all the clientele, so people working for them that wanted the government to make things work smoothly without knights beating each other, destroying shops, whatever, in the city streets. Right? In part, that's where also the military development of these communes passes through. Right, the growth in importance of infantry that will, in Italy specifically, will never surpass cavalry, but that was also in relative terms to cavalry, but was also actually the strongest in Europe at this point. So in absolute terms, so you have a lot of stuff going on. And a very strong level of synchrosis in this, right? It's not anymore a simple associational mechanism. It's the capacity of disciplining the population and maintaining control on the city, on the countryside, because this would ensure the sane polity to be able to offend and defend the commune, right, from internal and external enemies. The gradual differentiation of the arts and crafts, I made recently a video about them for the Italian communes specifically, constituted of course, an important propellant of this government, because, of course, of the economic power that lay behind it. Starting with the 13th century, in a great city, different guilds, such as the blacksmiths or the drapers, were provided with the same institutional form to interact with the communal institutions. Essentially, their members had similar needs. They would, of the higher ones, they would discourage competitors. They would preserve the quality of their products. This had always been run through a degree of violence. I mean, every association humanly has always worked in that sort of protective sense. And in relative terms, we're looking at a comparable economical weight, meaning that what was being built about these guys was in many ways just like the expression of these same productive activities. In the first years of the 14th century, so we're looking at some generations later, the guilds were still an artisan group, while the state by now had been run by a sort of cartel of a few great businessmen that acted on a European scale. We've seen how the Italian trade was essentially moving the entire Western economy by promoting locally, of course, the same manufacturers and organizing the commerce. It's not to say they were only businessmen. These were powerful oligarchs, house leaders, people with land, with retinues that had always that role that, again, the elite had always had in the city and outside of it, right? So these are, I already addressed this topic. Sometimes you say often this concept of the Italian city-states as mercantile republics. The question is, why do you need to add that adjective mercantile? I mean, yes, there was a lot of trade going on, but there was also lots of stuff going on, and like every community trades. It's not that these communities were say, based on trade in relative terms more than others. They just had, of course, they were incredibly rich, and thus they were also incredibly developed, but as such they did their business in ways that were not, you see, were not even public technically. I mean, the commune was to rule over these, the same business, and to protect it and to provide security, for example, for the merchants. It was all some sort of even, international right regarding the, of course, in a very rudimentary way, because it was very heterogeneous, as much as these polities that otherwise were quite homogeneous, telling the truth, were still different competence, territorial, etc., would allow the same networks to function, etc. And focusing on this on the military side of the story, we will see now, is sort of more interesting, because it shows you how actually most of that wealth was actually spent, and how practically the entire development of the Italian communal institutions was pretty much like the ones of any other country of the time, revolved around the military expenses that were stratospheric for the time being, and like like with an insane output in absolute terms, even for the times. In this case, so everywhere, essentially, these small corporations had the traditional guild had undergone a crisis, right? To make long story short, and this is just by the scope of, like, if you are like a draper from Siena, right? You may have had, of course, been living one of the most. I made a video about Siena, by the way. I see actually a couple. This was one of the richest, most important cities, lots of bankers, textile production, but and Siena had bankers pretty much all over Western Europe and beyond. And the question is, like, you're still an artisan that works locally, right? So the scale by which the magnates can effectively run and even a transcontinental business, especially as long as the Pax Mongolica had kept open the routes with China, well, you're still not going quite to be the guy who runs this, if not in a minimal part of the entire traffic and production, right? So in some cases, this distinction had been formalized by the end of the 13th century through the distinction between the major and minor arts. We've discussed this in some other videos, especially the last one on the arts and crafts, which means that essentially there was, like, Florence is a beautiful example of this. There were the major arts that in that case Florence was a bit more of a mercantile center compared to the others, like, considering the fact they had a strong popular government. They were dramatically ramping up their commercial power in many ways. So these guilds there, like the major ones, had monopolized great part of, big deal of international trade. And there were the minor ones that were still represented in the system, but of course had less power, right? So these were still operating within the city. You couldn't simply oust them. It was not an hegemonic power within the city. You could simply say, well, okay, well, we buy everything. Like, I don't know, the Medici in the same Florence would do, but by the mid-15th century. Here we are in a much more, in fact, sort of truly republican dimension, where, say, there is an idea of a conception properly of common good. In fact, the res publica, for that matter, that revolves around, okay, if we are all one into this as a commune, we can crush the neighboring ones on the battlefield. And of course, all this activity was aiming at financing the same army, the same communal forces. In fact, passing to the armed societies, we see the same picture. It's a bit more complicated. We can do also something more in depth, but also at this level, there had historically been just like every parish saying contributing with its own amount of armed men. to the communal expeditions. There had been of course, an important development of the concept of particularly the popular militia, right? The concept of citizens in arms had always been at the core of the communal identity, even before the communes. It's something that dated back from late antiquity, and it had essentially remained very strongly. But there was also a great divide between, say, again, the miles that, say, ran. Was part of a clan who had members in the consular class, etc., and that went at war on a decree, etc., and the average levy infantryman who, was also maybe a good one, right, individually, but mostly fought in these groups, and the tension between the two had always sort of reflected by quality and quantity relations was more powerful in the system anyway. And so what happens when the commune stabilizes is that, especially in the ones run by the signori, such armed societies that had once sort of preserved partially the rights, right, of and the representation of some groups were disbanded, right? This is a process that happens really on the long run, right? Because the people technically never gets fully demilitarized, right? There always was a necessity to go in arms, etc. But this also depended greatly on who armed the people for which eventuality. So if anything, there is an ever greater police force. People are virtually disarmed, and the state takes ever more on the burden of paying for, as we'll see now, mercenaries, but also for arms and armor, right? So the important thing, a bit like in Roman times, you see, when you read how the various comitia had been founded, you realize that there was originally a basis, also in Italian communes, between the local council, right, the local community represented in some higher institution, so its houses, its lands, etc., and the political rights measured on the basis of how many armed men they could provide for the commune. Right? This process tends to, just like in ancient Rome, to eventually unbalance itself, right? And the people loses factual power, and there are ever greater oligarchs that are able to arm large masses of sort of disadvantaged, a bit like during the Marian Reform, right, with the great lords of war of the late Republic. And here it's similar, actually. Actually, it's a great parallelism that you can draw. In fact, we will look at it a bit more in depth, also from strictly military historical videos, right? This process naturally was simplifying the aforementioned issues of hierarchy, of unity, of command, the affirmation of the podestà and the signore, together always with a communal body of government, was going tendentially toward that direction. Incidentally, the Italian armies of the, say, between the end and of the 13th and the beginning of the 14th century are easily as objectively the strongest armies in medieval history. The amount of manpower, of collective training, of arms integration, and just sheer expenses for it in terms also cost-benefits ratio is utterly insane, right? In pop culture, nobody has ever covered this in a serious way, also because the topic has never really been studied and researched. But it is an actual thing, right? And these communes spent a traumatically shocking amount of wealth exclusively for warfare. and it's something insane. Like the level of, again, belligerence in this system, the amount of men brought on the field is just like equal in the different regions, even just as singularly Lombardy and Tuscany, as much as you could have, I don't know, in northern France, right, as for the royal armies. It's utterly insane. And we must absolutely go everybody. I'm making these videos a bit like a preparation. I don't know, I think about the Italian Communes we made more than 100. But it's really necessary because without context, one cannot really understand how and why this is the case. And this is crucial. Like the expenses, the army expenses are the main deal here. Without mentioning the actual military outcomes, right? Many, if not most, Italian communes actually get a signory as a consequence of a military defeat in open field. Like their army gets crushed, they are weak, and they lost in part because of that, because they were politically fragmented. And so at that point they get a lord, and things do not necessarily get better depending on who you are, but generally speaking the greater powers also confer themselves that sort of more autocratic direction for like reasons of metus hostilis, some sort of martial law of sort, right? And so, of course, you can see how the elimination of the armed societies of the people was framed also in this broader redefinition of the communal military system, of the army apparatus that needed, of course, a strong stattal administration, taxes, control territorially. Everywhere with the rise of new governments, you see, for example, the appearance of mercenary troops that are by far the best available. This corresponds with essentially the aforementioned disarmament that happens not just at a popular level, also the greater houses with the aforementioned excuse of the anti-magnate laws, like as we've seen, the system was run by magnates, but it was a magnate that seemed more dangerous than another. They would ban him, or they would prohibit him to go in the army and things like that. And so, in order to be, just like they had called a podestat, it was normally a foreign guy, like a guy from another Italian city, sometimes, could be hundreds of kilometers away. They start hiring mercenaries, and these mercenaries there are Italians, of course, throughout the whole period, but they start, hiring essentially Germans, Frenchmen. These soldiers had always sort of been around. If you look at Italian history, and we'll have to make further videos on that. But at this point, with the struggle between Guelphs and Ghibellines that is really internationalizing from Italy across the entire Europe, you have the Angevins in Naples that back to the Guelph communes. You have finally with Henry VII's expedition a massive injection of German and Burgundian mercenaries. You had, of course, before the Angevins, you had Manfred of Sicily, made a video about him that used German mercenaries even more than the Siculo, like the Siculo-Norman barons of southern Italy. But there is an increase literally on these guys that are actually pretty powerful, because they are sometimes just noblemen who had undergone a crisis. We've seen it for both France and Germany. Really, like there is a similar process. The nobility becomes ever more oligarchic, right? In princely Germany, you start having these princely states. Just like in parallel, the Italians were creating their own states. You see, in France, we've seen it with the military system. Also, before the 100 Years' War, you have certain noblemen that just gain basically the upper hand, and the others are sort of suffering with the thing. So, given that Italy is overbearingly rich, all those guys come from north of the Alps to find actually a pretty good job, right? And fighting. In part also, like the French tend to be for the Guelph troops, the Germans from the Ghibelline ones, but eventually it's the Germans, right, until probably the mid-14th century, where some other nationality appears. Think about the Provençals, the Gascons, the English, right, especially after Bretigny, but we're substantially later with John Hawkwood, etc. So this is like we stopped to the mid 14th century. We'll see that second half of the 14th because it's also very interesting. It's also one of the most famous, but in pop culture. But this other part is not, and this other part is much bigger. It's overwhelmingly much of a larger system. Like it's before the Black Death. It's much bigger, much more structured. Later, it's more like a privatized sort of decline system of some sort of that is true for Eurasia after the plague. In any case, these mercenaries have a lot of success, right? There are many Italians as well that are easy to find with that money, especially considering the amount of exiles that had been regularly expelled from this city or another, and that thus could be hired as mercenaries, and were normally, because they were powerful people, they were normally like some aristocratic clan of sort. They were knights. They were good at that job, and these mercenaries are permanently just heavy cavalry, overwhelmingly. And it's really at the beginning of the 14th century that you see how important, how specifically heavy mercenaries were in the Italian armies. Right? They were almost always sided by city, like properly communal knights. Armies as a whole, right? The infantries again were utterly insane in level of development and collective training, something you don't find even up to well into the early modern age and beyond. Like say masses, tens of thousands of regularly drilled pikemen, like not even the Swiss during the Renaissance. And I'm not kidding. Like just look at the numbers. It's that easy to see, really. And yet again, the mercenaries, the heavy cavalry, constitutes, as we were saying at the beginning, always the decisive arm. The beginning of the 14th century is the moment in which, in some areas of Europe, like Scotland, German Ditmarsha, Switzerland, in part also the English royal armies, but those were an exception because they were really molded from the top, which they managed to beat cavalry in a way or another. Right? This doesn't mean that they were necessarily the strongest infantries out there, but that they emerged in a context in which there was some sort of weakened opponent of some sort, very often at the periphery, where the feudal authority was declining, some stuff like that. But we tend to overlook how actually big of a deal, right, the Italian infantry development was at this point. In any case, we see how the city knights are essentially declining, right? There is all a problem here regarding the exhaustion properly of the citizenry. The fact that, like, just like today, like look at how people like react in front of the war, like, we don't want to pay taxes, right? We don't want to pay for the military expenses. You find this sort of populistic movements also in late communal Italy. And predictably, all the people who behave like this get crushed, right? Either socially or politically, or both, right? And they lose, militarily speaking. Instead, the ones who pay the taxes for arms are victorious. At least that immediately reflects which civilizationally superior polity and people really it is, right? And in fact, of course, those who have power do not shy away from wielding it, right? If they are a functional government. We've seen it often. We've seen it with Milan. We've seen it with Pisa. We've seen it with... They all have different histories, but they are practically doing the same thing. And other communes instead are crushed in open field at that point. They sort of give up. They're exhausted. Actually, they could have... they were still rich communities overall, but they decide... Right, this could be entire communes or just certain sections of the victory of the leading ones, which they say we don't want essentially to go to the military expeditions anymore. Right, there is all a further strategic background that entails the relation between the city and the countryside. I will not digress on it. Just you will find it in the top 6 comment. It's about how the title is along the pattern of like how the rural aristocracy managed to defeat the commune or something like that, which is like it sounds as if the communes were destroyed. Actually, they would remain the unavoidable cornerstone for any rule in the district, but they were objectively, like when you look at the expansion of this more powerful cities, the way these managed to choke actively the enemy communes is by, of course, inserting these exiles that were already rooted in the city districts, because they, even if they had exiled, they had castles, etc. And the commune never quite fully, absolutely, totally, completely manages to oust these guys, right? Because it entailed literally to carry out a siege for every single damn castle, and sometimes they succeeded, right? Also initially with the people, etc. They're still quite active by the beginning of the 14th century from a military point of view. But in the longer run, this thing is worn out, right? There is a general crisis that you can't even read in these terms, like that Europe, like it's not that the Black Death arrived out of nothing, economic crisis was just look at today's times, right? There is a shocking amount of wealth every freaking where, like nowhere in history. This is exactly how it happens here. And yet people manage to fuck it up because they're weaker, right? Essentially, you can read even the Black Death as a consequence of the fact that people had softened up, and this had brought to the masses falling down and being weaker also in turn bodily, right, immunitarily, and to get this, actually triggering the spread of the pandemic, rather than this emerging out of the blue from nowhere. That you see, it's of course both things at the same time, and there were the preconditions for that to happen, because they all go too much in pattern with one another, and so there is a general sense of collapse even among cities that had thought up to a few decades before to be fundamentally solid, right? Needless to say, the most powerful, the pre-existing stronger powers are also the best suited for emerging. Like that's a very important lesson we must learn from crisis, is that the story that, yes, the civilization declines, but it's basically substituted by another, it's BS, right? The strongest powers that normally remain the same even after the crisis, right? That may be something, yes, the proportions have changed to some extent, but it's not that they are subverted, right? You can have enormous crises through history and then the same powers even emerging stronger than before. It depends, really. Here, really, the blows are heavy, right? But focusing more strictly on the Italian communes, the general strategic relevance and active military role of the citizenry declines, right? And simply because these communes can't afford to pay lots of mercenaries, and for many reasons that are actually very logical when you look at them from, aside from this moral strength or not, like they go with that in a functional way. Even in the so-called age of the soldiers of fortune, more like in the later 14th century, it's not really like the picture of this mercenaries coming from nowhere and ravaging Europe for no reason. They were always controlled by the local powers in doing so. They were called, used, and also expelled. Italy is actually a very instructive example of this, also because none of those mercenaries, for example, root themselves in. It's not like, I don't know, it had happened like with the Normans that had literally taken over a part of Italy back in the day. None of these foreigners, they all come back home, right? They do not manage to install themselves, carving, even with the communal permission, a sort of principality. It's always the communes that are actually very into especially fighting against one another and throw these guys against one another, but the latter are always sort of alienated and marginalized. They do not find as mercenaries a real space in this world. So in some cases, some communes tried to maintain alive the sense of military participation, especially those popular communes that had always been very republican in outlook, that had usually sided with the Guelphs, tend and even succeed in certain times to maintain like the popular army. A case is Bologna, for example. We should make a video about that. That after all manages to smooth then the trauma of the passage toward the signory, and that sort of manages in fact the commune also to remain substantially autonomous in a moment in which pretty much all the others were taken down by a few other big ones. Bologna was a fairly large city itself, so that also plays as a factor. But we will see these stories provincially in greater detail. Then, of course, every city had the impellent need at a point to resort to the most obvious public laws, like in the Romano-Germanic recruitment. Every free, able-bodied man was eligible for it. It was actually a privilege other than a duty, like to participate to the army. There is an extreme lot, for example, of peasant forces that are drilled into the communal army. That they make actually the majority of the troops, but like they are well equipped by the communes. They have also this incredible level of collective training when it comes to maintaining formation of pikemen on the field, on the side of cavalry following on the enemy flanks when they broke the wing in front of them. There are specialistic troops the commune mostly invests in, not just the mercenaries, but say the crossbowmen. In fact, what you see, like also in the decline of the countryside of the district, is that the peasants were so squeezed that the agriculture suffered, and so towards the mid 14th century, also with the demographic crack of the Black Death, you see that the only troops that actually remain are the heavy cavalry of the mercenaries and the crossbowmen on the wings. You don't even hear any much more of that existed, but were not unitly mobilized or relevant so much of those massive infantry wings of, say, even counting them, 5,000 per block, right? So this is like it's a huge deal. You can almost plastically, like dimensionally touch like how big the crisis, the consumption, the exhaustion of the resources really was by that point, right? There is no doubt that like this picture, like compared to the beginning of the 13th century, it was a very strong popular participation also in the army. There was even an opposition to the knights in a way. This point had been surpassed because actually knights and infantry act in the art of war has really advanced. They are completely synergic. You don't have, say, the infantry going their way, the knights their way, because politically the state has managed to make them act together. This is extremely important. But it's evident that the meaning of the military participation of the citizenry appeared remarkably changed compared to the previous century. The same growth of the military needs that pushed towards the recruitment of salaried troops provoked the increase, obviously enough, of the communal expenses. This is by far the single most important chunk of the total budget. Most important, let's say, if you look at the second half of the 13th century, this is already a big deal, right? In the 14th century, it explodes. It becomes something insane. This is triggered by Henry VII expedition. Essentially, Guelphs and Ghibellines start fighting in a way that they had never really done before. That's all a thing that we'll have to see a bit more in depth in the video on its own. And so, what actually appears in the 14th century that had not quite been a thing before, at least in a relevant sense, was debt. Right, in the 14th century is probably a accumulation of debt by these communes that had never been needed in the first place. And of course, Just think about this even in function with the international crisis, the banking crashes, things like that. These guys had made so much debt, and they at some point the system is not able to pay back anymore. And so many cities also finish like this in let's say as economy is just a reflection of broader problems. It's not just because of the money. It's still like we will see this how also this banking system really worked, because banks were just like now affirming themselves together with the state. Before there was just like a sort of money lending system trade, but not quite the bank as we start seeing as the pillar of Western civilization from the late Middle Ages proper. And I made a video about this for specifically the Italian banking system, but also for others. Now, in order to pay for these debts, the governments recurred to strategies that, of course, had already been experimented, but especially they had to find new solutions for this unprecedented level of debt. In the 13th century, especially in the years of the war with Frederick II, and in the immediately following ones, the choice of the financing, say in the debt, right, financing system, reflected faithfully the type of regime, right? Those regimes who had been backed, for example, by some powers, like could be even the emperor, Naples, whoever. It could be also private people, you'll see now. They would receive, in fact, mostly some voluntary loans by these entities, in committing themselves to reimburse these in a short time in different ways. For example, it was a way to sell communal goods, right? Yeah. For example, it happened also the ones that had been confiscated from the enemy exiles, right? So technically the same people that this money had been necessary to fight against. And so saying, okay, we take those guys out, we'll give you, pay you back in this way. There was also a way to, of course, exempt the creditors from the tax, like from the tax system, like the direct or indirect ones, by imposing. This was also a thing. Loans or special collections to particular groups, like for example those internal enemies that had not been exiled yet. But it was also very interesting. Thus, these new regimes had established a direct contact, if we can so say, really tying them with groups provided with economical resources that were willing, most of the cases, only to invest in the communal success. This is, I think, very relevant. If you look at how, for example, I don't know, the Milanese power was built, or the same Florentine one, you realize that some private bankers had said, okay, well, I will finance the communal expedition if you can crush that other commune, and you let us cash those guys' assets. Right, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, literally, the Visconti based their own Lombard power on this regional conquest, fueled by the same banks in that way. This was typical also of, tendentially, of those communes that had some sort of authority backing them. But the popular regimes that were often also a bit more on their own. Not always, only true. There was always someone sponsoring them, like depending on which side they were. But overall, there were some communes that were a bit more autonomous and sort of self-reliant, and who would privilege those tax collections based on, like, essentially some forms of extraordinary contribution that were not to be paid back, right? To say literally, like, we may have to make debt because without that we don't have an army to defend ourselves, so everybody pays for that. And this is it, right? And these collections were tendentially more equal, meaning that they were required to basically all the community, which also reflects what we were saying before for these centers, that these are the guys who tend, for example, to have still the old military standing, right, with a greater popular participation. They say, okay, well, you don't want to go to the expedition, because at some point they tried that. Again, the Bolognese example is one of the best. Okay, you don't present yourself to these various like calls that we make. Okay, but I will tax you then, right? You don't want to go to war, we will pay someone to go for you. This had already been used. Like, for example, the cavallata system in Florence was based on the same exact concept. Like, you could let's say again, if you were rich enough to provide with war horse, whatever, for the military expeditions, you could simply say, okay, I will send another guy, I will put all the money for it, and either the commune takes care of that, or I literally find another person. That's fine, and it is really fine in that case. The important here is how much the expense would affect eventually the community, right? And how much war would wear out the same. And war cannot be avoided. Like, wars are started by people that, as Machiavelli says, may not have the luxury of ending them instead when they want. But say if you're attacked and the other guy keeps on attacking you, like, it's not that you can stop this, meaning that, okay, I stop fighting the war, the guy stop fighting me. It doesn't work like that. At that point, the guy will take you over, and this is exactly what happens when somebody decides to give up, as it happens in these cases. So these more popular regimes would tend to keep alive like the citizenry, like the civic sense in general, by sort of distributing the debt a bit more all over the single individuals. Again, it's not so categorically laid out, but these are tendencies, patterns, like we see them. Like, of course, they would practice both systems at a point. And in any case, the regime, even in the latter case, was pointing on the consensus of a group, right? The traditional taxpayers that were tired to, however, at a point, sustain the entire economical cost of the war. That at the time was really heavy, right? It was not like today that you really can afford to pay a lot, and your life is not changed at any sensible level. You can make the difference. And today we're terribly soft and weak and incredibly dumb, politically and strategically. It would just take to want it, right? It's not plenty of money. Here the system, like, you could feel it, right? It's not just like you could be sent directly to war, but it's really a matter of like being there much less well around. These are pre-industrial systems. It doesn't matter, like, these are literally the richest communities in the globe, and that this region has the highest per capita wealth in the same. Like, these kind of expenses would be just a much bigger deal in relative terms. And in fact, such systems of funds raising were not satisfactory by the time of the early 14th century wars, right? Those were much bigger and much more serious. The context, again, up to that point, like from 1266-68, the Angevins had substituted themselves to Manfred of Sicily. So there was a major Guelph power tied to the French crown that had substituted with a major Ghibelline one tied to the Germanic monarchy that, however, at that point had exploded fundamentally. Hence, the Angevins take over, and they remain literally until the beginning of the 14th century hegemonic. They're not really governing directly these places. Sometimes there are podestats from Provence, from places like run by the Angevins, but they actually have a big, again, economy is booming, right? So they don't need to be pressuring. They have also an important capacity of intervention. They can afford to to send some troops here and there. The Catalans, for example, were actually Angevin enemies during the Vespers War, but after the Caltabellotta peace, the same Angevins, like the Aragonese disband them, and the Angevins hired them, and they sent them as actually small garrisons, also not particularly strong soldiers, because they are immediately substituted, in fact, at the beginning of the 14th century, as soon as big war starts happening, by the French and German mercenaries we were telling before. But that had maintained, in fact, a sort of broader stability. When Henry VII arrives, everything changes, because the entire northern Italy, virtually the entire northern Italy, is brought under Ghibelline domain. Like in Milan and Verona, the major power of the area are now under an imperial vicary. They are local, like in the Visconti and the Della Scala, respectively. And basically, even after Henry VII does what he has to do, he is crowned in Rome. He tries to besiege Florence and fails, and then eventually dies on his way to Naples. But after that, like this was not even nothing in comparison to what happened later, because the system has been shattered, and before finding an order, to rebalance itself, it sort of brings to the structuration of these other powers continuous wars for like 20 years, right, between these Italian powers that can put together armies of 30,000 men on a regional scale. The Battle of Montecatini in 1315 is the largest of the period. You don't even find it on the Cambridge Encyclopedia of Military of Medieval Warfare. Inexplicably, like, you find smaller battles from the same Italian thing, but since they were maybe more famous from a literary point of view, people, okay, let's insert that. Except Encyclopedia My Eyes, This is the shocking and appalling level of subcultural illiteracy that you may think, we know everything about medieval warfare, medieval history. No shit, right? This is the reality. People in general do not know shit about history whatsoever, right? Those who try to be historians barely do anything. This is the result in which we are, right? And this is not a good place for it to be, in general, right? We have the best academia, we have the best system, but we could do so much better, and we don't. Just because people are that lazy, in fact. So in order to sustain the system, given the increasing amount of debt that was forming, as we've seen, the regimes began to reform, essentially, and predictably, the system of indirect taxation. Essentially, they increased the how do you say it in English? The collection, of the tolls already existing, and introducing new ones. And according to the most damaged sectors, the regimes revealed their own choices, their own projects. It's like today, where debt is already high, but there is an emergential situation that brings us to need to make more debt fundamentally. How do we do this? How do we invest ultimately the expenditure of this money without making it in a way that it can return to us effectively? That's the big deal, right? And it does concretize itself also in wars in this regard, because again, all this is happening because of a broader attrition. And if you look actually at how the system had been working, predictably, it wasn't even too much of a difference in, say, in the technicalities of how to do that. This The way the communes made debt for paying military expenses was pretty much the same that has started even before the Peace of Constance, right, from Barbarossa's times. But the most important step in this, in the, say, beyond also the beginning of the 14th century, was the spread, this is the most important thing, of the consolidated public debt, right? This system had previously been instituted only in those maritime republics that had founded their economy primarily on naval trade on a longer distance, so they needed just to invest more on the or more boldly on terms that were referred to specific expeditions and so on, and so they were just more habituated. These were also the places that had the most advanced accounting and banking techniques, etc. So they had, and only in part, done the same. By the way, at this point in Italy, you have consistent. Yes, you have some minor centers, but it's like the maritime republics are just Venice, Genoa, and Pisa. All right, and Pisa, for example, and Genoa does have an hinterland, but it's all mountains in a way, so they don't actually make a lot of land warfare. Venice is on a lagoon; it's surrounded. It probably doesn't have yet terra firma. Pisa instead, and made a video about that too, does have an hinterland that is also pretty well intertwined with all the other, Tuscan affairs. And there you can see how actually this is some of the most effective communes in terms of funding the army, like the also in terms of political and strategic, political vision and strategic capacity, right? They know how to handle everything well. They are the most tempered way to the signory. They have the best commanders. They have the best forces. They have also a very strong citizen body. They have a strong city infantry. They actually carry out the best military, like they have the best tactics. I mean, at least the Italians used the same tactics, but these guys were the ones who performed them better, the best actually. The aforementioned Battle of Montecatini actually proves that. That's the masterpiece of the year. As a matter of fact, it may well be the single most complexly functional say enacted tactics of the entire medieval history. Again, here we are temporarily at the peak of medieval civilization, right? And here we see a lot of that at play. So according to this other system, the one of consolidated public debt, that was adopted by an increasing quota of communes, the citizens would provide the commune with some loans that could not, however, be cashed, but on which you could mature at least some interests that you could even transmit to your own heirs, or using them as payment titles. That's very interesting. So of course you were investing in the stability of your own commune. That was literally, the only place where you could really be. Like, of course, there is some mobility. You can think to change life somewhere, but generally speaking, these communes are really the center of everything. So what you want, if you have a house there, if you have land there, like, you want to remain there. Like, there's not much of another convenient approach, right, to it. So you would essentially keep funding the commune to stand on its feet. You understand how the stattal power is backed in this regard. There is an increased credit to it for these mostly defense reasons. Defense talking about military reasons in general, because it could be also, as we've seen, expanding at the expense of other communes. So you would pay again to get something back from, cashing from other communes by extorting that money. Is quite interesting. That's all the politics and the war of this period. And this system had a great advantage because, as we just observed, its success was intimately connected with the simplification of the internal political system. Essentially, you were paying not for some strange set of demi-private organisms, but actually a few higher public ones. That's the state. You understand that this is a civic measure, as we were pointing out before, one of political cohesion at least, because only in a city tendentially, say, brought under an institutional unity, it was possible for all the citizens that had the possibility of giving, literally, the credit to the commune for fundamentally and potentially indeterminate time, meaning that this was just a regular source of income for the state, and stabilizing all those process of, for example, think about the army, say, founding and armament, and all the infrastructure was needed to maintain the men, the gear, etc. Like, this is something that you can't just do by paying every once in a while for, especially in a moment in which warfare is endemic, continuous, right? The state needs these resources to, say, feel the capacity to withstand the enemy attacks in the first place, and even carrying out your own for your purpose. So everything was negotiated to some extent. It wasn't so immediate, right? But there were, as we've seen, in fact, mixed ways of just getting more money. Like in some emergential situations, you may have had basically just a steady income, but you could ask for more, right, depending on the circumstances. Thus, in the broader picture, also at a tax level, the strict correspondence between political projects of the groups and the contingent reforms that had characterized the communal, basically all the communal era, was being gradually surpassed. Right, there is a greater stability, a greater source of steady income, right, and this goes in parallel with the definition of the commune as a state, as a single polity, a single body, right, a single institution. The necessity of that, and I can't stress this enough, was based by the fact that the same governments, the same policies, were not appearing as fully stabilized, right? First of all, like from a military point of view, that's the thing I care about the most. There were attacks coming from different fronts. The governments were the expression still of a composite, say, of a group of different interests, right? It wasn't like it's not before the Code Napoleon in at the beginning of the 19th century to have an absolute state that works like it. So when we talk about state here, we mean like a sufficiently solid level of hierarchy and power concentration, right, by these times standards, right? And in this, like, especially the unitary direction of the way, say, politics would operate, right? So that everything was still the sum of different groups that contributed differently, etc. The point is that now they were disciplined by a sound point of reference, an authority was truly unitary and around which the entire say, body was further consolidating, right? And in fact, I would say that the most important step here is ideological, meaning that in spite of all the, for example, we've seen it often in the videos about the various Italian communes, the various government reforms, like the one of the statutes, the councils, who was really in charge at a point, one thing never came less after these steps. That is to say, the recognition of the superior nature of that authority, that head, right? This is crucial. It's a concept that stands also in this pre-humanistic times, from the reading of the classics, of the contemporary juridical science. But there is a lot going on, right? The struggle between the papacy and the empire, as we've seen, Italy had always remained at the forefront in terms of especially the juridical advancements of medieval Europe, and so consequently all the politological view. These are the years of Dante that was the full expression, if you want, of this world. As part of that elite, he was one of the priors of Florence. He was a knight. He had land. His father was a moneylender. He was in exile. He backed the emperor. He knew Henry VII, Can Grande, etc. And he was a hell of a, not just a poet, but as you know, a political theorist, and the voice of medieval civilization. In all this, like in all these stimuli, let's say, that came from the contemporary landscape, you could have polities shaping on the basis of these same principles, right? We see this from many factors, of course. Today we do not go too much in depth beyond these concepts, but for example, the changes in the political exclusion in this fatidic beginning of the 14th century, the regime changes lived by the generation in which these changes happened. So we see in Florence and in Bologna, for example, between the blacks and and whites, Dante was a white Guelph. He was expelled. As you know, the black Guelphs are the fully dominant, like pro-papal, pro-Angevin ones. In Milan, from the Della Torre to the Visconti, we made recently a video about medieval Milan, etc. So in this case, it's mostly from you see, it's inverted. Like Tuscany has, and Bologna a little bit has the passage from de facto the Ghibellines to the Guelphs, or some more neutral government to the Guelphs, and Milan from the Guelphs to the Ghibellines, in parallel with Henry VII's expedition, etc. All these changes had, as basically always as a consequence, in fact, the exiles of the political opponents. That's when Dante again goes into exile for having opposed himself to Boniface VIII and the Angevins that de facto established the complacent regime in Florence that still remained autonomous, but saw other people in power, as well as the measures issued against their supporters. Right, for example, Dante had exiled his best friend, who died of malaria in exile. He was quite saddened by this, but he also put on the fore the duty as a citizen. That was the sense of Florence seen. For example, that's a great example of this ideological change. What their commune really meant. It was something beyond, it was the center of their world from which everything stems. In fact, also in Dante's work, you can easily see how Italian and European affairs are seen through the lens of Florence, right, and then Tuscany, etc. So it's unavoidable in many ways. And this instability that was a sort of purge, as you understand, that aimed at homogenizing the political establishment, could also entail at the beginning of the 14th century a change in the form of government. For example, in Modena, when the Este were expelled in 1306, these guys were early lords, all right? The Este ruled from Ferrara. Modena was just bordering, and the local commune reestablished itself, without a lord, until in 1312, in fact, the Signory came back with the Bonacolsi of Mantua that also ruled over Modena. These were allies of the Della Scala. We will talk about the cities, by the way. We haven't covered, I think, even the majority of these Italian communes in the regional series, but we will go on with that. But also in these cases, the expulsion provisions were not justified anymore on the basis of the necessity of defending one side, right? But the one of defending the government of the city. This is incredibly important in terms of political theory. There could be the Guelphs, the Ghibellines, this clan or the other, the people and the magnates. The important here was becoming the idea that the government of the city had to remain intact, right? It's an anti-destruction of civic centrality, right? It's the idea that the state is needed as a superior authority to make order and to discipline people, right? That up to that point, even if they had not been that functional, and this is pretty much the history of state building, right? States are born for a specific will, they can think, but generally speaking, they are established in a way that is, maintaining an order that stateless systems basically cannot afford. The enemies were thus accused to have attempted rebellions, to have carried out corruption. Dante was accused of this, like as a formal accusation, to be expelled. I mean, all this came also with political. It didn't have to be true, but it would be sort of the just as a concept, like the excuse for saying, like, these guys could not stay in the city if they had betrayed the laws of the same, the order of the same, the justice of the same. There is all a brand today, we don't talk about it, but consider this in the context of the Holy Roman Empire. These cities technically had an ultimate ruler. There was a great sense in these struggles between Guelphs and Ghibellines. The empire was not that present. I mean, Henry VII was essentially the strongest presence of the time. As you know, it was a power largely depending probably also on the local troops. At least it was an expedition, a serious one, a big one coming from the Alps, but there was the plague at the siege of Brescia. They had to replenish forces. The King of Aragon also sent some further help. In any case, the idea is that was we've seen it recently in the videos about law, right, and Roman law. Like, there had to be some natural order that these imperial subjects were to find, right, even if the emperor was not present, and the city started becoming a bit like that's a bit like the modern sense of the Renaissance, the moral compass of this. Not that the concept was anew, but the essence of the city deciding autonomously of its own constitutions and whether these infringed divine law or all these things were hotly debated in all these dynamics and mechanisms. We will surely make other videos pointing this out and observing how relevant these debates really were, but it's also and especially about the sense of the imperium that must be wielded, and the city has to sort of wield its own and ensure like just government, right? So the frequent and varied recurrence to such a new exclusion of the enemies strengthened not only and not especially the like the faction that had remained within the city, but rather the idea that there was a of the legitimacy of the existence of a part inside the city that could exclude another and presenting himself as the head of the entire commune. Right? This is also new for the same Italians. The idea that it doesn't matter how much the commune had been born out of a plurality of groups, there was a right and a wrong, and there was a capacity thus to discern what kind of order could be established, what kind of laws had to be issued. Where did the city lay internationally? Because as we've seen with this intercontinental trade, with the Ghibelline Guelph struggle going on between the emperor and the papacy, you must force, and these cities were some of probably the most important basis of the struggle, strategically and logistically, for the entire Europe. That the question is like you must, even just, there is a broader responsibility in asserting this authority, this power, because there are bigger things at stake than there have ever been, and so you can't quite even just make too much philosophy about it. You must take control of that. And there is an enormous, like, this of course goes in parallel, for example, with the control on, for example, the city supplies, all what's made these centers work for the first time in a truly unitary sense. Prisons are starting being built in modern sense here. Think about the walls, building, upkeeping them, the territorial control. These are not things at that point that you can't simply leave to, well, okay, there's some sort of unspecified mechanism that more or less will work by itself. You must ensure a regularity, a stability, a continuity. You can't do this without the state. You can't do it without the entirety of the community contributing orderly and constantly to it, right? It's challenging, it's tough, but it does happen, and it does bring results. The cities are competing with one another on this basis, right? It was a lot of rivalry, even just for municipal pride reasons, not just war or politics, but they were all with one another, of course. So, also in this new, within this new system, of course, many previous elements remain standing. A particularly clear case is the one of the judiciary institutions. For example, for doesn't matter how spread new procedures, as we've seen, aim at hitting the political enemies, and the qualification of potential political opponents began to weigh ever more as a worsening, like as a factor during the both the civil and penal trials. Doesn't matter how much the Podestas tribunals were sided by more specialized organisms that depended ever more on the government's indications, let's say. The old seats of resolution of the controversies remained standing, right? The traditional way, like, law had been administered, say, judgment, like tribunals, just like the statutes, like, of the government were at some point reformed, but overall, like, the mechanism could not be reformed radically. Like, you don't have the capacity to, again, absolutely alter the entire picture that simply, right? But you can start doing this on top of all these other systems that had happened. So having, on the longer run, these bigger institutions becoming more important and more reliable, also for the same citizens, right? For whoever searched, like, for this, for justice, right? And forming a new plurality characterized by new balances with these previous institutions as well. So this is like, it's actually a lot of stuff. I don't know how. I see these videos tendentially receive ever more views, so I don't know whether I managed to, instill an interest in the topic. But it's as if, like, again, these stories had never been told to a popular extent, and we needed to render people, generally speaking, more aware of such events, such dynamics, such polities, and more. It's always a quite complicated challenge for whoever to teach this history. But we try. We're not scared. Let's see where we go with it, right? I think the concepts were clear. Again, we will come back on the Italian Communes every once in a while because it's part of our major medieval European topics. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.